One of my close relatives owns a large piece of property deep in the forest. I'm talking about almost 200 acres of woods surrounding a house that honestly had no business being where it was. The house itself was beautiful. It was large, modern, and expensive looking enough that if you saw it somewhere outside a major city, you'd probably assume the people living there were extremely wealthy. But it wasn't outside a city. It wasn't even close to a town. The nearest paved road was miles away, and once you left that road, you had to travel down a series of narrow dirt roads before eventually reaching the property. Because of how isolated it was, the house wasn't worth nearly what something similar would have been worth in a populated area. To me, though, that isolation was the best part. My relatives were hunters and outdoors people, so they had bought the land partly because they wanted privacy and partly because they loved the forest. And because I was allowed to visit whenever I wanted, I started using the property for camping trips. Maybe 3 or 4 times a year, I'd drive out there, spend some time at the house, and then head into the woods with a backpack and a tent. It was easy. I didn't need to research trails or worry about finding a legal place to camp. I didn't need to make reservations or deal with other campers. I could just show up, walk into the forest, and disappear for a night or two. At least that's how I used to think about it. I had heard about it from my relatives before. They described it as an old shelter where workers had apparently slept during the logging operation. For whatever reason, I had never gone looking for it until that trip. I arrived at the house at around 10 in the morning. I spent a couple of hours talking with my relatives, eating something, and getting my gear together. At around 1 in the afternoon, I left. According to one of my relatives, the old logging site was about 40 minutes away on foot. The problem was that there wasn't actually a trail. I had to cut through the forest. The first 20 minutes were normal. The woods were dense, but I was familiar enough with the property that I wasn't worried about getting lost. I kept checking my direction and occasionally looking behind me to remember landmarks. Eventually, the trees began thinning, and that's when I saw the first sign that something had once been there: a rusted piece of metal sticking out of the ground. Then another. Then a pile of old boards almost completely covered in moss. The remains of the logging site were scattered everywhere. Most of the buildings were gone. Not demolished, collapsed. Large piles of rotting wood lay between the trees, and in some places it was impossible to tell whether I was looking at the remains of a building or just a collection of fallen trees. Then I saw the shelter. It stood about 50 yards ahead of me, and I remember stopping because it looked wrong. Not scary, just wrong. The building was old, obviously. The wood was darkened and weathered, and part of the roof looked like it had been repaired at some point decades ago. But it didn't look abandoned. It looked like a cabin. If you had placed it somewhere along a hiking trail, I probably wouldn't have thought anything of it. That was what surprised me. Everything else around it had collapsed, but this one building was still standing. I approached it slowly. The door was closed. There were no footprints that I could see, although the ground around it was covered with leaves and debris, so that didn't mean much. I grabbed the edge of the door and pushed. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a long groaning sound, the door slowly opened. The smell inside hit me immediately. Damp wood, rust, and something else. Something stale, like a room that had been closed for a very, very long time. Light came through several holes in the walls and roof. Inside were rows of bunk beds, 8 on one side, 8 on the other. Most of the metal frames were rusted. The mattresses were torn apart, and pieces of old fabric and stuffing were scattered across the floor. Something had clearly been living inside at some point, probably rodents. I walked through the building carefully. There was nothing. No tools, no photographs, no old equipment, no graffiti. Nothing to suggest anyone had been there since the logging operation shut down. That was strange enough. A building sitting abandoned in the woods for decades usually collects evidence that someone has visited. Teenagers, hunters, explorers, someone. But this place felt untouched. I spent about 15 minutes looking around before deciding there wasn't much else to see. The sun was still up, but I wanted to set up camp before it started getting dark. Originally, I considered sleeping inside the shelter, but after seeing the collapsed buildings around it, I decided against it. The place was old, and I didn't feel like waking up under a fallen roof. So I walked about 100 yards away and found a relatively open area between the trees. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and started a small fire. For the next few hours, everything was completely normal. I sat there, listened to the woods, occasionally looked toward the shelter. As the sun went down, the forest changed. The trees became darker. The spaces between them became black. Eventually, I could no longer see the shelter. I knew exactly where it was, but from where I sat beside the fire, it had disappeared completely into the darkness. I was cooking dinner when I heard footsteps. At first, I didn't react. There were animals everywhere. But these weren't animal footsteps. They were too slow, too deliberate. Crunch. A pause. Crunch. Another pause. I stopped moving. The footsteps were coming from the direction of the old shelter. I stood up. And then a man stepped into the edge of the firelight. I remember how sudden it was. 1 second, there was nothing. The next, there was a person standing there. He looked to be in his 40s, maybe older. His clothes were filthy. His jacket was worn and stained. He had a thick beard and looked like he had been living outside for a long time. And maybe it was because I was sitting beside an abandoned logging camp, but he looked almost exactly like what you'd imagine an old-fashioned logger would look like. The thing that immediately bothered me, though, was his size. I'm not a small person, but this guy was huge. Broad shoulders, massive hands. The kind of person who made you instinctively aware of how isolated you were. He smiled. "Hey, buddy." I didn't say anything. "I'm looking for my friend," he continued. "He said he'd be around here somewhere, but I can't seem to find him." As he talked, he kept walking closer. "You haven't seen anyone, have you?" I remember looking behind him. There was nothing, just darkness. "No," I said. "Sorry, I haven't seen anyone." I should have told him he was trespassing. I should have asked him who he was, but I didn't. Something about the situation made me uncomfortable enough that I just wanted the conversation to end. The man nodded. "All right." Then he smiled again and stood there. At first, I thought he was waiting for me to say something, but I didn't. So he just stared at me. Maybe 10 seconds, maybe 30. It felt much longer. The fire cracked. Somewhere behind him, a branch snapped, and the man never looked away from me. Finally, he said, "Good night." Then he turned around and disappeared into the darkness. Just like that. I stood beside the fire for several seconds, listening. I expected to hear his footsteps, but after the first few steps, nothing. The forest was silent again. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe he really was looking for his friend. Maybe he was a hunter. Maybe he had somehow entered the property from another direction. There were plenty of explanations, but none of them made me feel better. The thing that bothered me most was how comfortable he had been. He had walked directly into the middle of an isolated campsite, deep inside private property. He hadn't acted surprised to see me. He hadn't asked who owned the land. He hadn't seemed lost. He looked like he belonged there. I started packing. I wasn't completely sure I was leaving, but I wanted everything ready, just in case. By the time I finished, my backpack was packed and my tent was still standing. I sat down and finished cooking my food. Then I made a decision. There was absolutely no reason to stay. The house was less than an hour away. I could sleep in a real bed. And more importantly, I wouldn't have to spend the night wondering who else was walking around in those woods. I put out the fire, took down my tent, put on my backpack, and started walking. I had only been moving for maybe 2 minutes when I heard footsteps ahead of me. Fast footsteps. coming directly toward me. I froze. My first thought was that it was an animal, but then the footsteps stopped right in front of me. I couldn't see much. The moonlight barely reached through the trees, but eventually I saw the outline of a man. He looked almost identical to the first one. Similar height, similar build, similar clothing. For a second, I felt relieved. This had to be the friend. Maybe they really were together. Maybe the first guy had found him. I swallowed. Your friend was looking for you. Nothing. He went back that way, toward the shelter. The man didn't move. Where is he? His voice was quiet, flat, almost emotionless. I pointed behind me. That way. Where is he? The exact same question, same tone. I suddenly realized that he wasn't looking in the direction I was pointing. He was looking directly at me. I didn't know what to say. Then I heard something behind me. Footsteps. Slow footsteps. One, then another. Someone was approaching, maybe 20 feet away. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The man in front of me hadn't moved. He was still staring. And I suddenly understood something that made my stomach drop. If the man behind me was the first guy, then he had found his friend. They were both here, and neither of them had said a word. I took one step forward. The man in front of me stayed where he was. Another step? Nothing. Then I started walking. Not running. Not yet. I walked directly past him. As I passed, I could feel him turning his head, following me. I kept walking. I could hear the slow footsteps behind me stop. Then, after a few seconds, I heard another set of footsteps move toward the first man. They were standing together. I knew they were, but neither of them spoke. No greeting, no conversation, nothing. I kept walking, and then walking faster. Once I was far enough away that I couldn't hear anything behind me anymore, I ran. I ran through the woods in complete darkness. Branches hit my face. I nearly fell several times, but I didn't stop until I reached the house. The next morning, I told my relatives everything. Their reaction confused me. At first, they looked like they didn't believe me. Then they started asking questions. Where exactly were they standing? What did they look like? What were they wearing? I expected them to be concerned. Instead, they seemed confused, almost concerned about me. One of my relatives told me something I hadn't known. There was no public access to that side of the property. The only reasonable way to reach the logging site was through their land. I asked if anyone else had permission to hunt there. No. Had they seen anyone else recently? No. I never found out who those men were, and I never went back to that part of the forest. But years later, one thing still bothers me. The first man said he was looking for his friend. The second man kept asking me where his friend was. But when they finally found each other, neither one said a single word. When I was in my early 20s, I made a decision that completely changed my life. I moved away, far away. I rented a small cabin surrounded almost entirely by forest. The closest real town was about 50 minutes away. There was a small collection of houses and a gas station maybe 10 minutes from me, but that was it. For the first few months, I loved it. I worked from home, so living in the middle of the woods sounded perfect. No traffic, no neighbors, no office. Just me, my laptop, and the forest. For about 3 months, everything was fine. Then something changed. It happened gradually. At first, I barely noticed it. Whenever I stepped outside, I would feel uncomfortable. Not afraid, just uncomfortable, like something wasn't right. I ignored it. But over the next week, the feeling became impossible to ignore. Every time I walked toward the trees, I felt dread, deep, irrational dread. It was the kind of fear where your body reacts before your brain understands why. My heart would start beating faster. I'd feel tense, and I'd suddenly want to go back inside. Eventually, I stopped going into the woods completely, which was ridiculous. The whole reason I had moved there was to be surrounded by nature. But now I couldn't bring myself to walk more than a few feet from the cabin. I tried explaining it to myself. Maybe I was adjusting to being alone. Maybe I was becoming paranoid. Maybe my imagination was getting the better of me. But after a week, I got tired of feeling like I was afraid of something that didn't exist. So I decided to force myself into the woods, face my fear, prove to myself that nothing was there. I walked outside, crossed the small clearing around the cabin, and entered the trees. Immediately, the feeling returned, worse than before. The woods were completely still. No wind, no birds, no insects, nothing. It was so quiet that I could hear myself breathing. My mind was telling me to turn around, go back, get inside, but I kept walking. Eventually, I reached a point where I could barely see my cabin through the trees, and that's when the feeling became unbearable. My heart was pounding. I felt like I was being watched from every direction. Then I heard a voice. Hello? I spun around. A woman was walking toward me. She looked completely normal, maybe in her 30s. She was dressed casually. She was smiling. Hi, she said. I'm Lynn. I was so caught off guard that it took me a moment to respond. Uh, Hi. She introduced herself and said she was just out for a walk. Then she asked if I wanted to join her. The way she talked was unusually friendly, almost overly friendly. She smiled constantly. I told her I was actually on my way back home. Then I asked where she lived. She pointed somewhere behind her. Around here. That was all she said. She asked again if I wanted to walk with her. I declined. Something about her made me uncomfortable, and it wasn't just because of the strange feeling I'd been having. It was the way she was acting, like she had been expecting me. I turned to leave. Then, behind me, she spoke, still smiling, still using that cheerful voice. You shouldn't be here. I froze. For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. I turned around, but she was already walking away. What? She didn't respond. I watched her disappear between the trees, and something strange happened. The dreadful feeling I'd been experiencing for the entire week slowly disappeared. As she walked farther away, it faded, until suddenly the woods felt normal again. I stood there for maybe a minute, then I ran back to the cabin. That was the moment I decided to leave. I didn't care if I sounded paranoid. I didn't care if there was a logical explanation. Something was wrong. I packed everything I owned into my truck. It took hours. By the time I finished, the sun had gone down. I was putting the last bag together when the feeling came back, instantly, stronger than ever. I stopped and looked toward the window. There was someone standing at the tree line. My entire body went cold. It was Lynn. I knew it was her, even from that distance. She wasn't moving. She wasn't waving. She was just standing there, watching the cabin. I stared at her. She stared back. Then, slowly, she lifted one hand and pointed. Not at me, past me, toward the inside of the cabin. I didn't turn around. I grabbed the last bag, ran outside, got into my truck, and left. I never looked back. I managed to get out of the lease. I lost money. I didn't care. I have no explanation for what happened there. But sometimes I think about what Lynn said. You shouldn't be here. At the time, I assumed she was warning me. But after seeing her standing outside my cabin, pointing inside, I'm not sure anymore. Maybe she wasn't warning me about the forest. Maybe she was warning me about something else, something that was already inside. A few years ago, I took a trip to northern Utah. It wasn't a vacation with an itinerary. I didn't want to visit museums or cities. I didn't want to go hiking every day. I just wanted to disappear for a week. So I rented a cabin. The listing described it as peaceful and secluded. That should have been my first warning. The cabin was located near the Idaho border in a small community of rental cabins. When I say community, though, I mean maybe 6 or 7 cabins spread across miles of forest. Nothing else. No stores, no restaurants, no gas station. Just trees. The road from the highway was gravel, about 6 miles of it. At the end, smaller dirt roads branched off toward the cabins. I followed a sign marked Cabin 4. The road became narrower, the trees got closer. Eventually, I reached the cabin. It was smaller than I expected, and strangely placed. Most cabins have some kind of clearing around them. This one didn't. It looked like someone had simply found an empty space between trees and built a cabin there. Some of the trees were only a few feet from the walls. It made the place feel enclosed, almost trapped. I parked, grabbed my backpack, and went inside. I had been unpacking for maybe 10 minutes when someone knocked on the door. The sound startled me so badly that I almost dropped what I was holding. 3 knocks. Slow, heavy. I walked to the door. There was no window, no peephole. So I opened it. A tall man stood outside, probably in his 30s. He smiled. Just checking to make sure you're okay. For some reason, that sentence gave me chills. Not because of what he said, but because of the way he said it. Like he already knew something was wrong. I laughed nervously. Yeah, everything's great. Thanks. He nodded. Good. And that was it. I closed the door. But about 30 seconds later, something occurred to me. I hadn't seen a vehicle. The man hadn't been standing near a car, and the other cabins were far enough away that he couldn't have reached mine that quickly. I opened the door again. Nobody. I stepped outside. Nothing. No footsteps, no vehicle, no sound. The forest was silent. I stood there for a few seconds, then laughed to myself. Maybe I hadn't noticed his car. Maybe he worked there. It didn't matter. I went back inside. Later that afternoon, I took a nap. When I woke up, it was almost dark. I grabbed a drink and sat outside on the porch. The weather was perfect. No wind, no insects, nothing moving. At first, it was peaceful. Then I started feeling watched. I don't know when it started. Maybe I saw something without consciously realizing it. Maybe I heard something. But eventually, I became completely convinced that someone was standing somewhere in the trees, watching me. I stayed outside anyway, trying to prove to myself that I was imagining it. Eventually, it became too dark. I went inside. The cabin was small. One living area, a couch, a table, one bedroom, one bathroom. That was it. I tried turning on the fireplace. Nothing. Apparently, there was no gas. So I sat on the couch. Then I heard a crash. It sounded like something had fallen over, maybe even broken. The sound came from the back right side of the cabin, but there was no room over there. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and went outside. When I rounded the corner, I saw stairs leading beneath the cabin, and at the bottom, a door was open. I stopped. I was sure I hadn't seen that before. The door led into some kind of crawl space or basement. My foam light couldn't reach the back. It was completely black. The longer I stood there, the worse I felt. But I also knew that the sound had come from somewhere beneath the cabin. So I started down the stairs, slowly. The space underneath was small: concrete walls, shelves, a pile of objects scattered across the floor. Something had clearly fallen. But as soon as I stepped inside, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and shined my phone up the stairs. There was a man standing at the top. It was him, the man from earlier, the one who had knocked on my door. For a moment, neither of us moved. "Hello?" My voice sounded weak. The man stared down at me, then turned and walked away. I ran up the stairs. By the time I reached the top, he was gone. Again. No car, no footsteps, nothing. I didn't stay to investigate. I ran inside, locked the door, packed everything, threw my backpack and cooler into the car, and left. The drive out felt endless. Every few minutes, I checked my mirrors. I kept expecting headlights behind me, or to see someone standing in the road. But I saw nothing. Eventually, I reached a motel. The next morning, I called the owner of the rental. I wanted an explanation and a refund. The man who answered sounded elderly, definitely not the man who had visited me. I explained what happened. There was a long silence. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "I don't have any employees." I asked him if someone else worked there. No. I asked about the other cabins. He told me none of them were rented that night. I should have been the only person there. I stayed at the motel another day. Eventually, the owner met me, and we spoke to the police. After that, I never heard anything. No updates, no explanation, nothing. Years later, while writing this, I searched for Cabin 4. The listing was gone. The entire rental business was gone. No announcement, no explanation, no reviews explaining what happened. It was as if the place had never existed. But one detail still bothers me more than anything else. The first time I opened the door, the man said, "Just checking to make sure you're okay." At the time, I assumed he was the owner or an employee. But after everything that happened, I started wondering why he had really come to my door. And after hearing the crash beneath the cabin, finding the open door, and seeing him standing at the top of those stairs, I started wondering something else. What if he wasn't checking to make sure that I was okay? What if he was checking to see whether I was still there? And whatever had been underneath the cabin that night, maybe it wasn't the thing making the noise. Maybe the noise was the thing trying to warn me. Because after I found that open door, I never heard another sound until the man appeared at the top of the stairs, staring down at me, waiting, as if he had been expecting me to come down there.